Hello and welcome to Wine Blast, the place where wine glasses are always topped up and celebration is never too far away. And that's particularly true of this episode, in which we are raising a glass, or three, to mark a very special anniversary, aren't we?
Now, if you're claiming that we've only got 3 glasses of wine on the go, I'm afraid I can't support that blatant untruth. The table in front of us tells a very different story.
It does.
It does. Okay, as long as that's clear. But yeah, beyond that, this episode is indeed all about celebrating the 50th anniversary of the famous Marlborough wine region in New Zealand, which was first planted to vines in August 1973.
Now, we're going to tell the story and everything, of course, but just as an opening thought, isn't it incredible how far Marlborough has come in only 50 harvests? You know, some traditional wine regions have been growing wine for thousands of years. Even some New World areas have been at it for hundreds of years. And yet Marlborough is right up there in terms of wine quality, wine potential and excitement these days. And that's all in just half a century.
I agree. It's amazing. I mean, it kind of makes you reflect on your own achievements, doesn't it? What have I done in 50 years?
Maybe that's not a good idea.
It's not. You know,
don't go
that way. Existential crisis looms. Anyway, you know, as you say, we're going to tell Marlborough's full, remarkable story in due course. But, you know, I guess just to whet the appetite, we could start by saying this is the stuff of Hollywood scripts, isn't it? You know, think about it. It's your kind of classic zero to hero plot. It all begins with just one hard-working immigrant family setting off to seek their fortune in a remote island on the other side of the world. Then the brave visionary son takes a huge punt exactly 50 years ago, risking financial ruin in the process on a region where, you know, even the skinny sheep are laughing at him for doing this. You know, various disasters ensue, but then a series of slices of luck combined with, you know, proper Kiwi grit and inventiveness. And suddenly, you know, the Queen's visiting to plant a Sauvignon Blanc vine, and everyone in the world is drinking this stuff and producers are coining it, and you're helping shape the future.
And then the ultimate accolade, of course, a Wine Blast podcast episode. It doesn't get better than that, does it?
Heady heights. I mean,
no, but you're quite right. I mean, it's a fantastic story, just how it all began. And we've got some expert insights to help us tell that story, of which here's a very brief snippet.
Why would grapes grow in Marlborough, you know? It's never been done before. Nobody even drank wine, so this is going to fail. All of a sudden they're going, oh, this potentially could be something,
Jamie Marfell there, who as a boy remembers those first vines being planted, and who's now gone on to become Greek winemaker for Pernod Ricard, one of the country's biggest producers. His main brand, just to give you an idea, Brancott Estate Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, sells about 9 million litres every year. So, you know, he's making a fair bit of
a lot of Sauvignon.
We're also going to be getting a very different perspective from Hans and Therese Herzog, Swiss emigres who looked all around the world with a very critical eye before settling on Marlborough in 1994 to make their tiny production unique wines from just one organic vineyard.
Now, we should add at this point that this is a sponsored episode in conjunction with New Zealand wine growers. So thanks to them for giving us the excuse to enthuse about what is, to be absolutely honest, and this is nothing to do with sponsorship, New Zealand is one of our favourite wine regions in the world.
Yeah, and
officially.
But Marlborough within that as well.
And Marlborough within that. So we've been lucky enough to visit a few times, and we are constantly tasting and drinking the wines. Today being no exception, given we have, as we've said, a brilliant lineup of Marlborough wines here to recommend to you, and we'll do that at the end of the episode.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to taste a few as we go along too. Is that fair enough?
Well, we can
it's
try.
A storytelling. You need refreshment. You know, it's good for the voice. Good for the resonance. I'd say it's good for the focus.
Yeah,
maybe we'll put that to the test.
Any excuse. Enough.
Anyway, let's not muck around. Why don't we start at the beginning?
Yeah.
And on that note, we could actually be celebrating the 150th anniversary of Marlborough wine, because, and not many people know this, the first vines were actually planted in 1873. And pop quiz, do you know the nationality of that wine pioneer?
The obvious temptation is to say French.
It is, isn't it? But Scottish. Ovs. Scottish.
Really?
Yeah, it's interesting, actually.
I didn't know that.
I know immigration was how New Zealand was populated, even by the Maori from the Pacific Islands from the 13th century onwards. But, even then, it's interesting how New Zealand wine is often the story of immigrants, be they from Dalmatia, which is in modern-day Croatia, or Lebanon, or Ireland, or Australia, or in this case, the Scotsman David Hurd, who planted a small muscat vineyard back in the day in the southern valleys of Marlborough. In those times, it was sort of for personal consumption, But it's interesting to note that vineyard has been revived today under the Arntsfield brand, so you can actually see that slice of history in Marlborough.
Yeah, but to be fair, that didn't last long, did it? Originally,
Yeah.
It wasn't. It wasn't the real beginning of Marlborough wine.
No, not in a proper sense. So, bit of context. New Zealand never really had much history or culture of wine drinking, and the temperance or anti-alcohol movement. Boo! It's a sound effect there. It was really strong in the late 19th and early 20th century. So vineyards, might pop up, but they'd end up disappearing. So what you had was a pretty basic local booze market dominated by beer and highly dodgy wine, mainly fortified stuff and hybrid vines, or just gut rot made from raisins, sugar, and wine.
Raisins, sugar, and wine, or raisins, sugar, and water? Maybe just water.
Raisins, sugar, and water.
Water
Was probably close to the truth.
But then it changed, did it not?
And there were a number of reasons for that. For one, Kiwis who'd served in both world wars in Europe returned with a taste for decent wine. Then the government helped by doing things like hiking taxes on foreign wines and local spirits. But most important was the sort of dogged work of companies like Corbin's, which was set up by a Lebanese immigrant, and also a number of wine producers set up by Dalmatian emigres, like for example, Babbage, Sellax, Mazarans, just to name a few.
And this is where we come on to the Yukich family, isn't it? And the founding of Marlborough. And I love this story. So Dalmatian immigrant Ivan Yukich had established a wine company in Auckland in 1944, which became Montana, and then, of course, changed name to Brancott in 2010. Now, by the early 1970s, Ivan's son Frank was desperate to develop production and volume and exports. But the land in the North Island was expensive, so he hatched a cunning plan.
I love a good wine plan.
Indeed.
Wine plot.
So Frank Yukich asked his viticulturist Wayne Thomas to identify the best unplanted vineyard land in New Zealand, and Thomas quickly settled on Marlborough. Now, we'll come on to why in a second, but the best bit is that Yukich realised that if he rode into town as the big wine man asking to buy land, people would see an opportunity and prices would go through the roof. So he formed a cover, Cloudy Bay Developments, and got the estate agent to find him 1,200 hectares in 24 hours, at which point he put down a straight 10% non-refundable deposit out of his own pocket.
Because he hadn't told the Montana board, had he?
No. I mean, the deception worked on many levels. So he defied the Montana board on this one. And let's be clear, this was madness. He'd just bought a vast tract of nothingness, known for growing, as you said, skinny sheep and livestock feed. And when they started to plant vines, everyone was laughing at him. So he could have been ruined by this.
And the board initially turned him down, didn't they? And demanded answers as to why he'd done it.
Yeah. So Wayne Thomas, you remember Yukich's viticulturist, laid out the reasons he thought Marlborough would be good for wine. Free draining soils, warmish maritime climate, fairly dry, generally free from frost, frequent winds to prevent disease. Also, crucially, intense sunlight to promote photosynthesis and flavour development. And the Maori name for central Marlborough is the place with the hole in the cloud. Anyway, all the same reasons that make it such a good place to grow wine today. But this wasn't enough for the board. They wanted more validation. So Thomas had to get second opinions from various Californian wine experts to support his reasoning before the board did eventually, reluctantly, back the move.
I mean, you always get echoes of the publishers who turned down Harry Potter, or the music labels who turned down the Beatles.
I mean, I think it was a close run thing.
Yeah.
And it goes to show that establishing a new wine region isn't just about data. It's also about bravery and vision and ambition and a bit of luck, an interesting yet more foreign influence, this time from the US. Anyway, Montana paid 1.3 million New Zealand dollars for the 1,173 hectares of land, just over $1,000 per hectare, and the first vines were planted in August 1973. But Frank Yukich wasn't one to do things by halves. He bussed in a load of journalists for the planting ceremony and declared, "Wines from here will become world famous."
It kind of reminds me of Jan van Riebeck in South Africa in 1659, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He said something very similar.
Yeah.
Well, the wines from here will become famous. And I guess it's probably maybe another example of bravery, but you could also say just bravado in terms of broaching entirely new ground for wine. People need a flag waver to say, "Here's going to be amazing."
You need these
even
people.
If maybe they don't even believe it themselves.
Well, this is true, but anyway, I think at this stage it's probably time to bring in Jamie Marfall. As you said, Jamie is now a successful winemaker for the very company that planted the first vines, Brancott, which was Montana, and which is now owned by French drinks multinational Pernod Ricard. But he's also Marlborough born and bred, so he has a few stories to tell. We caught up with him in the Groucho Club in central London, and we wanted to start off topical. So the first question was, why is Marlborough so important in the story of wine?
I guess it's all about Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It's really put us on the map. It's what makes us quite unique, and it's the wine that you can pour at a dinner table anywhere in the world, and somebody who knows a little bit about wine would go, "Oh, what's that?" And you more than likely, if you knew a little bit about wine, they'd go, "Oh, it's probably a Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough." It is quite unique. It's our unique offering. And the industry in New Zealand, the wine industry is over 100 years old now. These wineries are 125, even older. But in reality, it didn't really kick into action until Marlborough came on the scene 50 years ago. And a part of that is the journey. It's not just the 50 years. It's planting the first Sauvignon Blanc, which was a couple of years later. Then making the first wines, and getting the first accolades in the early 80s. So it wasn't 73 when we first planted. It was like the mid 80s. Then like the UK. To be honest, it was the UK wine writers, the UK wine industry here. This is quite unique. We quite like this. And all of a sudden, even in New Zealand, they were going, "Oh, we could be onto a winner," but we didn't really know. And I guess being a young industry, we learned from our mistakes. We learned really quickly. We diversified. We just did what New Zealanders do, pull stuff out, have another go, pull it out, have another go. Went, "Oh, this it's kind of sticking, and it was good. It was good.
So a story of resilience as much
as resilience. Oh no, I'd say probably resilience. It's probably we stuck in there because it was tough times in the 80s, the early 90s. Wine companies weren't doing well. There was resilience here, but there's also that whole innovation, I guess. Innovation is quite important, and the wines we're making. Well, I've been making wines for 32 years, and like the first Sauv Blanc we were making, I remember 1990, and it was only about 10% alcohol, and it was pretty. I look back now and went, "Oh, it's probably a nice wine, but I'd probably chuck it out and just saying it's pretty bloody average. We could probably do a lot better." So even our wine styles are diversified. There's the industry's gone from zero, and I think we're up to about 30,000 hectares planted in Marlborough. Now in 50 years we've gone from zero to 30,000 hectares, and it covers across Marlborough. Now it's dot. And we talk about sub-appellations and all sorts of stuff, which the consumer probably gets confused with. But for us, there's different styles of Sauv Blanc coming out of Marlborough, and it's really cool. It's pretty cool.
So a commitment to innovation as much as anything else as well. So you've mentioned quite a lot there. There's quite a lot to pick up on. So I'm going to just take it step by step. But, just before the dawn of, let's say, Marlborough, paint me a picture of what was New Zealand wine like?
I guess the fortifieds were quite big at some stage. I mean, the beer industry was the dominating industry. You've got to realise that beer was what it was all about. You know, the early 1900s, the beer consumption was large, and the beer companies were throwing it. Wine was not even in the background. People didn't drink wine. No, my parents grew up. We were born and bred in Marlborough. My parents never drank wine. My dad, Mum might have one glass. I don't know. A bottle of wine might turn up at the odd dinner party in my childhood. Probably never. But it was flagons of beer and
what would the wine have been if it did appear?
Oh, it's scary. I mean, I don't know. I know it was recipe based. When I first started in my youth, I saw some old recipes for making wine, and it was, it wasn't all back then. It was all pounds of grapes and litres of water and pounds of sugar and all
that was the recipe for making wine back in the day.
That was fermenting it, and amazing what you could do with a kg of grapes. You could make a lot of litres of wine. Yeah, it was just pretty. Yeah, I guess there was no regulations, so it was unregulated. I guess we're at the other end of the world, so nobody really cared what we were doing, as long as it's kind of filled a niche and it tasted okay. I'd hate to think what it tasted like. Yeah.
So good and bad stuff, but
good,
then going back to the origin of Brancott, Montana, as it was back in the days, the Yukich family. Yep. But then in August 1973, as has since gone down in legend, Frank Yukich bought a whole load of pretty cheap land, what was pretty cheap land in Marlborough, and planted vines and made a bit of publicity about it. So why was this different?
Even for him, he went out on a limb to take a risk on something which was probably not there. It was a huge risk. I guess it was unbelievably risk. And then he got the data. He verified the climatic data through Davis University. He actually had to get approved for the board that this was actually a goer. So he actually had to...
The board of
Montana, yeah.
The company.
Because the land was kind of purchased before the OK, then basically he had to go back to the board and prove that the fact that the land was actually... in the region was actually...
So he had to get approval from sort of the US, Californian winemakers.
I guess so, okay. No, there's no expertise. I mean, where was the expertise at the time? I guess it was either in Europe or in the US. And Davis University was a famous university. And when the data came out, they said, oh, yeah, that looks pretty good, But still, it's a risk. I don't know, there's so many... It's not just, the sunshine hours and rainfall. There's so many different things, frost data, all sorts of stuff that they probably never published or never had data on. I don't know. They might have had all that data, but it's pretty hard to predict a brand new grape growing region anywhere in the world just based on a little bit of data. I don't know. It's just crazy.
And this was sort of sheep farming country.
Sheep farming country,
right?
yeah. Okay. Bare land, so nothing. So even the concept of growing a grape in Marlborough was even on the radar. I mean, my mum and dad had a farm. We were farmers. We had a sheep farm at the end of the Brancott Valley. It was just crazy at the time, like me going on the bus to school, to see people ploughing up huge amounts of this was good farming sheep land, pulling out fences. It was like, why are they pulling out fences? That's crazy. And then they're pulling out trees and pulling out everything. Then basically big paddocks of flat area. It's like, what are they doing? It was like, it's crazy. It was like the time was stuff you'd never seen before. And the other weird thing, Montana went out and bought all these brand new tractors. My parents were poor, everybody had, because you're growing skinny sheep in Marlborough, which were good for nothing. The land was good for nothing, because there was no irrigation, no water, no centre pivots or anything. So it was dry land farming. So we just grew a few skinny sheep and didn't make any money. But all of a sudden, all this money come into Marlborough, brand new tractors. Everybody's going, never seen so many brand new tractors. There was so much capital went in, and it was like, this is just crazy stuff. And it was just crazy.
So you remember, as a local lad, thinking at the time, wine was almost like an invasion, and you thought, this is crazy, this will never last, this is just weird. And
the chat around the dinner table with Dad, Mum, and all our friends, it was like, this is going to fail, the thing is, why would grapes grow in Marlborough, Why?
Was it considered too cool? What were the impediments? Why did he think it wouldn't work?
It's more the mindset. It's more the fact that it's never been done before. It's just grapes, grapes. No, grapes didn't even grow anywhere in New Zealand, really, a little bit. And, nobody even drank wine, so it wasn't that important, was it? So all of a sudden they're going, this potentially could be something,
can just see the skinny sheep gazing quizzically at the brand new tractors. I mean, it's a great image, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's got a brilliant turn of phrase, hasn't he? I mean, this Sauvignon Blanc is sticking. And I love his honesty, saying he'd have chucked out the Sauvignon Blanc he made in 1990 if he'd had that today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it speaks to, just how fast and furious the progress has been. And, he makes the point, doesn't he? It was partly Marlborough that was the catalyst for the entire New Zealand wine industry to really take off or kick into action, in his words. It's all about this sort of classic Kiwi spirit, exemplified by one man, Frank Yukich, even though, Croatian immigrant, equal parts sort of dogged resilience and restlessly imaginative, innovative brilliance. And a massive risk he took on Marlborough back in 1973.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that spirit of innovation in a bit. Coming up, we have more from Jamie on the exciting ways Marlborough has developed since being founded. We also hear from Hans and Therese Herzog about their ambitions for weird and wonderful things in the region. To recap so far, these days New Zealand's Marlborough wine region is world famous for its Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir and much more. But 50 years ago it was a sheep farming wilderness in a beer drinking culture. But then Montana's Frank Yukich came along, took a massive punt on planting vines to make wine, and the rest is history.
Well, it might be history, but I think there's a bit more of a story to tell before it's a sort of fait accompli. And this is where disaster and serendipity comes in. So Montana planted the first vines to much fanfare in 1973. And Jamie told me it was probably a big mix of things that went in, mainly Germanic varieties for whites like Müller-Thurgau, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, also things like Palomino, Chasselas and Chenin Blanc, with Cabernet Sauvignon for red.
As you do.
It's an interesting mix,
it's
isn't
quite
it?
a mix, isn't it?
But then disaster struck. 70% of the young vines died of drought. So they replanted, this time trying to protect the baby vines with 800,000 ingenious little protective cones, which were immediately blown away by the winds. So you can kind of get the picture here, don't you? Anyway, somehow they managed to get some of these things growing. And in 1975, 2 years after the first plantings, the first Sauvignon Blanc was planted, or Savvy, as it's sometimes known in shorthand.
And do we know why Sauvignon Blanc was chosen particularly?
Yeah, no one really seems to know why. There isn't sort of one compelling reason and vision. Jamie said it was probably just a bit of a scattergun approach, as per the other plantings. So probably just, sort of a happy accident. Anyway, Montana made their first Sauvignon Blanc vintage in 1979, and, it kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah, I mean, Sauvignon Blanc does have a tendency to do that, doesn't it? You often hear about new plantings doing really well. New plantings of any variety have a tendency to do well for a couple of years, but it's a rare variety where often younger vines in general produce better quality than older ones.
Yeah, you do hear that, don't you? But then, to carry on the story, another disaster struck. Phylloxera. The vine pest that wiped out entire European wine regions in the 19th and 20th centuries finally caught up with New Zealand in the 1980s. But again, as with the drought, this cloud had a silver lining. On the one hand, it meant people were forced to replant on phylloxera-resistant rootstocks. But on the other, they could choose to replant with more popular grape varieties, which was, of course, at that time, Sauvignon Blanc primarily. And it was the same story when the New Zealand government sponsored a vine pull in the mid-1980s because of a wine glut. Growers took the money to grow up the mediocre vines and used the money to plant Sauvignon Blanc. Otherwise, Marlborough might still be, Müller-Thurgau country.
So snatching triumph from the jaws of defeat. It is funny how these things work out sometimes, isn't it?
Especially in wine. And meantime, they've been getting some good fortune too. So one example of this was the Cloudy Bay effect. So Kevin Judd told me how this came about. Kevin was the first winemaker of the famous Marlborough producer Cloudy Bay. We all know the name, don't we? He's now at Grey Wacky. We'll come on to that in a minute. Kevin's originally from England, as it happens, just up the road from us in Hampshire. Anyway, he told me how a group of Kiwi winemakers had visited Australia in the early 1980s for a conference in Perth, and they'd made a pilgrimage to Cape Mentelle, the famous Margaret River winery founded by David Honan. The Kiwi winemakers were impressed by the reds, apparently, but not so much by the whites. So they gave David a bottle of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc to try, and in Kevin's words, that bottle was the inspiration for Cloudy Bay.
Wasn't there a rumour that Cloudy Bay was nearly called Farewell Spit?
Yeah.
Is that right?
It is definitely a rumour.
I'm sure I've heard that somewhere.
I think it's apocryphal. Kevin certainly denies it with a smile on his face. You don't quite know with Kevin. It would have been brilliant, though, wouldn't it? Farewell Spit.
It was,
brilliant name for a
so
wine.
for those who aren't aware, Farewell Spit is a sandbank not far from Marlborough.
With a brilliant name that has relevance to wine, if you're spitting. But anyway, yeah. So David Honan, an Australian, and Kevin Judd, an Englishman, basically bought some Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc fruit. And this was at a time when the New Zealand wine scene wasn't in great shape. There was the glut and all this other stuff. Wasn't exporting much. So they just bought this stuff because they'd been impressed by this bottle. They got no winery or brand, but they came up with Cloudy Bay. They used Cape Mentelle's distribution and David's reputation. Their first vintage was 1985. And it kind of lit the touch paper.
Yeah. I mean, and it's probably fair to say things were happening on a few fronts around that time, weren't they? For example, Ernie Hunter, shall we say, a persuasive Irishman making wine in Marlborough, won the Sunday Times Wine Club Vintage Festival popular vote 3 years in a row with his Sauvignon. And generally, people just started to be wowed by this unique style of Sauvignon Blanc, totally different from the wines made from the same grape in Sancerre or in California. This was utterly vivid and pungent, in-your-face aromas of passion fruit and green pepper and waves of invigorating acidity. It was pretty much fireworks in a glass, and it was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, and the world sat up and smelt the coffee, as it were, or the Sauvignon, rather. And the Queen, ahead of the curve as ever, Queen Elizabeth II, bless her, planted a Sauvignon Blanc vine at the Brancott estate in 1989. And this was the time things really took off. So a few stats here. In her book, The Wines of New Zealand, excellent book, Rebecca Gibb, MW, says in 1986 there were 1.6 million sheep and 1,000 hectares of vines in the Marlborough region. By 2007, so 20 years later, the number of sheep was down by 2/3, and vines had proliferated 13-fold to 13,000 hectares. And land prices, interestingly, if you remember originally when Frank bought it, it was $1,000 per hectare.
Yeah.
They'd gone from $8,000 per hectare in mid-80s to $255,000 New Zealand dollars per hectare by 2007. Interesting that I've read something to say that lately good vineyard land in Marlborough is about $400,000 New Zealand dollars per hectare.
I mean, God. And this partly reflects just how profitable Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc has been. I mean, yields can be pretty big. It doesn't need aging or expensive oak, so it can be released pretty soon after the vintage. And New Zealand has actually done a good job of keeping prices at a relative premium. I mean,
it's not cheap.
No, it's not. And they've never sort of let it be undervalued, And just for reference, today Marlborough is just shy of 30,000 hectares planted, over 90% of which is Sauvignon Blanc. And Marlborough accounts for more than 3/4 of all New Zealand wine production and 90% of all New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc.
Marlborough's more than 3/4 of all New Zealand wine production. And that was from nothing.
There's quite a lot of regions in New Zealand.
Yeah, there are. But it gives you an idea of the scale. It's the engine room, isn't it?
It really is. It really is.
Yeah, it's just amazing to consider it was only 50 years ago. Anyway, it's really interesting to see how Marlborough has evolved to where it is today as well. And it's sort of exciting in that sense to consider the next 50 years ahead.
What it can achieve. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to talk about, isn't there? Yeah. But one thing I'd definitely highlight, if we're going to stick with the subject of Marlborough's most famous product, Sauvignon Blanc, is the way in which it's not just one thing anymore. So over time, Sauvignons grown in different parts of Marlborough have started to show different characteristics. And winemakers have very skillfully transmitted that in a sense of terroir in the wines.
Yeah, so you still get these big sort of pan Marlborough blends, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, like Jamie's Brancott Estate Sauvignon, for example, which puts all these different sub-regional characters together, blend them together. But at the same time, now you can get site-specific Sauvignons with very distinctive characters, from Wairau to Awatere or Awatry to the Southern Valleys.
Well, I mean, why don't we let Jamie take over here?
Yeah, I guess that's the key with the evolution, and we've kind of grown into our Sauv Blanc kind of trousers, and we kind of, we're starting to realise, well, Sauv Blanc's really good, and we're just starting to realise when we're in our tanks, if you keep a tank separate from all these different appellations, these sub-regions of Marlborough, they give you these little differences between wines. And basically, the warmer regions of Marlborough, say next to the Wairau River, which are on gravel, so that's where our Stony brand comes from. On average, it's warmer at night by 1 to 1.5 degrees over the growing season. So it's actually a warmer sub-region of Marlborough. So it bud bursts earlier, it ripens earlier, we pick it earlier and everything else. But it changes the aromatic qualities in the glass. So basically, we have less green characteristics. Because it's warm climate, it's less green characteristics. And methoxypyrazines are very low, so it's less herbaceous. But it tends to be, we get a bit more thiols, which are the passion fruit, grapefruit. So from a warmer region, we tend to get a riper style of Sauvignon Blanc. Then you go into the cooler parts, so the Southern Valleys, the clays, where it gets cooler at night, longer growing season, just cooler. Then you start building on some of these greener characteristics, and you get a completely different profile, say, from the Southern Valleys. Then you go up to the Awatry Valley, which is the valley over. Again, it's a later ripening region, and again, real green characteristics coming through, real zingy. You get those tomato leaf kind of herbal, kind of wild thyme, real crunchy kind of characteristics, and they kind of all completely different. So if you're making a regional blend, like a Marlborough blend, it's brilliant because you've got all these different flavour profiles to bring it together. But but you can make these sub-appellation wines, which are absolutely beautiful too.
Beautiful indeed. And we've got a beautiful map in front of us, haven't we? Yeah. The Appellation Marlborough wine map of Marlborough, showing all these sub-appellations from Lower Wairau to Central Wairau to Upper Wairau, Southern Valleys, Awatry, Blind River and Southern Coast. It really puts into geographical form. You love your maps, don't you?
I do love my maps.
You're almost stroking it, aren't you?
I am.
But it sort of puts into geographical form what you can taste in the glass.
There's no here be monsters. There's a little whale on it, actually, which is quite nice. But yeah, it really does. And this sort of ever-developing sense of sight and terroir in the wines, I think it's really encouraging. Not just in Sauvignon Blanc either, but also in things like Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris and Chardonnay, which are the next most planted varieties after Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough. And these varieties are also really exciting. Jamie says he loves Chardonnay, and it's one of the underrated varieties in Marlborough. I think we tend to agree with that. Absolutely.
But it's also not just about these headliner varieties, is it? One of the intriguing things about Marlborough is it seems that almost anything is possible there.
Yeah.
And those were certainly the thoughts of Hans and Therese Herzog, Swiss-born emigres, as we've said, who bought land in Marlborough in 1994 and make wine under the Hans Herzog brand. Hans is from a long line of Swiss winemakers, an ambitious and instinctive, brilliant winemaker who felt constrained in his homeland, so sought pastures new.
Yeah, they considered many places, but they just couldn't get better than Marlborough, which is quite telling. They found a relatively warm, gravelly plot near the Wairau River that reminded them of Pomerol in Bordeaux. Hans's original plan was to grow Bordeaux varieties as a sort of totally different kind of challenge than what he'd faced in Switzerland. But then he got a bit excited and didn't just plant Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot and Cabernet Franc, all the local specialities, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So he planted all those things. But he also decided to go for a few more eclectic varieties like Montepulciano.
Yeah, and they have other things now, don't they? Like Saperavi, Blaufränkisch, Arnais, Nebbiolo.
Yeah, and that's not all. So I asked them why on earth they'd gone for this sort of cornucopia approach.
It's probably hard for Hans to even explain it. But see, Hans loves wine. And they are, alone in Italy, how many grape varieties does Italy have? 2,500.
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
And this is only Italy. So there's so many great grape varieties. What we mostly know are the French grape varieties, and then of course the Barolo Barbaresco, Acca Nebbiolo, Tuscan wines, Acca Sangiovese. But there's so much more. And Hans is not somebody, I think that's why we work well together as a husband and wife team, because I do the other side. I try to keep Hans reasonable. But he's like an artist. And I always have to explain that also when we have young students, because why do you come to us? This is not a winery who makes money and marketing people should come to, because it's probably the total wrong approach. This is, but they say, because they see the work of a man who does it just for the passion. And I know that word passion is so overused, but in Hans's case, he is not interested in money or in long term or in planning or do a business plan. He just wants, he sees something, like we went to South America and then we did some blending in a really great winery there. And then we could see that the Carmenere gives really something special to the blend. So we came home and the next what I see is an invoice, a prepayment for the order of Carmenere. But do you know, he doesn't even discuss that with me. He just does it. And then in another discussion, I get to know that we have another white grape variety after a visit to Georgia. So Hans is a very spontaneous person. He doesn't think things over, but he's an excellent viticulturist. He knows his terroir. He knows Marlborough's climate. He knows what it can do. And he has, how do I say, the total self-confidence that he can make a great wine out of it. And that's when when he said to me, we have to leave Switzerland, it's not working out having, obviously an estate there and building one up in Marlborough. And it's quite hard to live a good life and friends and family and in a country where everything is beautiful as well, and to go to the other end in a totally unknown situation. But for Hans, this is nothing. Hans could easily, let go of 500 years of roots, where else I think it's often the women who think a little bit different. And I found it, so who sells the wine? How does it work there in New Zealand? They don't drink that much wine, we're talking about the early 90s. I had no clue of export or anything, because wines were sold from our estate. Customer came, they bought. Within 3 months, our vintage was sold, paid cash. So it was a good life. And then all that, but just Hans doesn't think like that. He just said, but it's fantastic. I promise you, I will make great wines. And that's all the promise. He didn't promise me a good life. Just great wines. So you really have, he can't really say that from himself, but that's really how Hans is. Yeah. And there are not many people like that. It's, I think it's a little bit the dying out race, actually.
So the passion of wine and in a way the feeling of obligation to try things, to experiment, to see what works, to push the bounds of possibility. I mean, would you say Marlborough is dominated by Sauvignon Blanc? Do you think Marlborough should be more ambitious, more diverse?
For me, you can grow nearly everything there in Marlborough, but to have reduced your yield, you can't grow like Sauv Blanc. It's not possible for great quality of wine. Even now, Marlborough makes huge amount of Sauv Blanc. That's the biggest production in whole New Zealand, Sauv Blanc, Marlborough. But you can go nice borderland, everything where you want to do. Very consistent.
But in all fairness,
only 23 years we make wine there. It's just amazing. No one bad vintage, honest. No one.
So that is a good question, isn't it? You made this bold move.
in order to be somewhere you could make virtually anything, that you weren't constrained by the climate or local laws or whatever. Have you fulfilled that ambition?
Yeah, it's for me,
Great.
Yeah.
What a lovely thing to be able to say. And if you think Marlborough were to get more diverse, beyond, say, regional styles of Sauvignon Blanc, what would be the best way to go for it, do you think?
Look, at Marlborough is actually more or less in big hands, big companies. That's a big the downside. I don't like that. Little bit more smaller wineries, more family-owned wineries, and the young generation is there, but they think about it big. Big is beautiful, and that's a bit sad.
Sometimes I think there is it's really true, big is beautiful. When you come from Switzerland, for us, small is beautiful. Artisan. I think what Hans wants to say, Marlborough can do anything. It's one of the world's best wine region. And we travel, when we can, every year to wine regions. And we come back and we say how lucky we are that we have land in Marlborough.
So the Herzogs are helping to prove Marlborough can do so much more than Kiwi savvy. They've only got their one organic vineyard, haven't they? And yet they're producing a whole load of amazingly diverse wines. And the secret, as Hans said, is low yields, attentive viticulture, minimal intervention in the winery.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people sort of dismiss, for example, Cabernet Sauvignon in Marlborough. But, we tried their Spirit of Marlborough 2016, a Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc Merlot blend, aged 5 years before release. And it was glorious. Absolutely delicious, wasn't it? Classic sort of tobacco and cedar, cassis, wild mint, beautiful gravelly texture, fine tannin, utterly seamless, cultured, still very young. So, something Therese likes to recommend drinking with brie. And a bit of truffle oil.
Yum. We also loved their Zweigelt. We tried the 2017. Yeah. It was like a sort of a beefed up version of Pinot Noir, wasn't it? Tons of berry fruit and then a savoury, meaty, peppery edge. So juicy and vibrant, but also serious and foody. Almost Italianate with that nip of chalky tannin. Absolutely delicious.
Yeah, and Hans recommends drinking that with some crispy pork belly. Yum. And these wines not only prove Marlborough can do all kinds of things beyond Sauvignon Blanc, but that the wines can age well, for example, too, which isn't always recognised.
Absolutely. And as we're talking diversity, we should also mention that Marlborough makes everything from pretty good traditional method fizz to sweet wines as well. And their work on lower alcohol wines has been pretty impressive too. Is there anything they can't do?
Yeah, it's sort of sickening, really, isn't it? On that note, actually, there was one final thing to mention before we come on to the tasting, and that's the sort of brave new world of the future. And Marlborough's becoming a hotbed of wine innovation. So I just want to bring Jamie back in briefly here.
And the vineyards, it's cool. We talk about it. We started a project about 5-6 years ago, and we talk about a vineyard of the future, and you got to wrap up, the whole sustainability, your people, everything else. But we looked at automation as the way forward. So we're part of an initiative it's called Smart Machines, looking at automated vehicles. So we have now got 9 fully automated vehicles on our vineyards, and by this time next year, they're hoping to get up to about 19 vineyards. So basically, we're going to be the way of the future for us and our vineyards is fully automated vehicles. So our vehicles at the moment they mow, they mulch, they can trim, they can leaf pluck and stuff like that. Now, hopefully in the future they should be able to do spraying bits and pieces. So it's a fully automated vehicle. So these are really cool vehicles. So they're going, they're out there operating today, these vehicles, and it just kind of changes our landscape where, okay, we started with big blue tractors, Ford tractors, 50 years ago. Now, 50 years on, we're talking about fully automated vehicles in our vineyard. So that's real cool.
Wow, vineyard robots in Marlborough. What next?
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? Hopefully not robot drinkers. We did talk a bit about this. He also mentioned things like remote probes to measure soil moisture, which feed back to computers, which control the subsurface irrigation pipes. Subsurface irrigation, interesting. Another sort of technological innovation. And that one's not just sort of new, it's now the way of the future, Jamie says. It's about minimising wastage, creating efficiencies. He also said they had to rebuild their wineries after the 2016 earthquake, and so they've introduced smart tanks with everything completely automated. They also use fruit decanters rather than old bag presses, which speed up the process, which means what used to take days now takes hours.
Yeah, so there was a time when being ahead of the curve for New Zealand meant everyone adopting screw caps instead of corks. But this is a different order of magnitude, isn't it?
Totally.
Anyway, now we need to get on to this tasting. But you did taste some of the Brancott stuff when you were actually with Jamie, didn't you?
Yes, I did. So I've already mentioned the Brancott Estate Sauvignon Blanc. We tried the 2022 together. This is one of the best distributed wines in the region. Made in large volumes, but it's really bright and crunchy with a sort of tropical roundness, sort of benchmark affordable Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and pretty decent value at 10 quid. Then we also had the Chosen Rose, their top Sauvignon Blanc. We had 2 vintages, but the 2015, this is this is quite old now, but it was just delicious, lovely, serious, savoury, layered, sort of complex new wave Sauvignon. We had the 2010, didn't we, at home? Not long ago. That was the first one, I think, and it was still
showing
delicious.
that these wines can age. Anyway, I'm busy tasting here. So talking of new wave Sauvignon, we've got a couple here from the brilliant Grey Wacky, made by Kevin Judd, as we've said, originally of Cloudy Bay fame. When we say new wave, we mean not just tropical passion fruit typical of Wairau or zingy tomato leaf of Awatry. We mean, so it's not just sub-regional, we mean other things are going on. So the straight Grey Wacky Sauvignon Blanc 2022, it is flinty and layered. It's beautiful. While the Grey Wacky Wild 2021, so a year older, has wild ferment, as it suggests. And it's a bit of old barrel, so it's full of roasted peach, and there's some fresh curry leaf, really serious, just an outstanding wine. And I think a wine that demonstrates the new frontier for Marlborough Sauvignon.
Absolutely. Moving on to Chardonnay, we're going to do this really quickly. We'll put all the notes on the website, but moving on to Chardonnay, we've got 2 outstanding examples here. First up is the Lawson's Dry Hills Reserve Chardonnay 2021. It's really a sort of classic style, quite leesy, quite nutty, savoury and yeasty, really, with a lovely, elegant texture. Then we've also got the Blank Canvas Reed Chardonnay 2022. Now this one is much more sort of struck match, sort of flinty, that snap crackle pop style. There we are. Pop. Yeah, it's fleshy and nutty. It's it's compelling. Absolutely delicious. Now, we did recommend the 2021 in our New Zealand Chardonnay episode, and we definitely say Chardonnay is a rising star in Marlborough.
Absolutely.
It's just beautiful.
Anyway, on to something a bit different. Pinot Gris. It's the 3rd most planted variety in Marlborough. Often New Zealand Pinot Gris sort of sits between Italian Pinot Grigio, which is sort of crisp, dry, usually a bit dull, and then the richer, lusher, far more interesting Alsace Pinot Gris style. But this one, Villa Maria, Seddon Hills, remember this name, Seddon Hills Pinot Gris 2020, is stunning. It's very much in the luscious, honeyed Alsace style, but it's fresh and refreshing, and it's full of baked pear, ginger, creamy honeyed notes. It is off dry, but perfectly balanced and amazing with blue cheese.
Yeah. And a reminder of the versatility of Marlborough, how it can do so many things. We've already touched on Hans Herzog's Zweigelt and Bordeaux blend, but there's Syrah, Riesling, and all sorts in there, isn't there?
Absolutely.
The sky's the limit. But, one thing we can't not mention before finishing, of course, is Pinot Noir, another star variety in Marlborough, especially in the southern valleys. And we've got a really good example here, a good value example, because that's something Marlborough can also do, really good value. It's the Wairau River Pinot Noir 2021. It's just 15 quid, which is really good value for good Pinot. It's kind of juicy, it's crunchy, it's smoky with a touch of spice and tannin.
Yeah, I'd say a crowd pleaser for a winter supper. And, as you say, great value. Right, we need to wrap things up there, but we'll put all the wine details on our website, so if you want more info, you can find it there.
Yeah, by way of closing summary, New Zealand's Marlborough wine region has evolved at warp speed over the last 50 years. From skinny sheep and shaky starts, the region has grown to be a serious producer of not just bright, breezy, savvy, but also seriously fine terroir-driven Pinot, Chardonnay, Syrah, Sauvignon, and much more. When Frank Yukich made the brave bet 50 years ago on Marlborough's wine future, he was taking a huge risk. But his boldness has helped forge a bright future, not just for his own company and Marlborough, but New Zealand wine as a whole. And all of us wine lovers are grateful to him for it. I think it's fair to say.
Too right. We'll all raise a glass to Frank and to all the many other pioneers and brilliant producers in Marlborough today. You get a sense that there's still a lot more to come from this beautiful region, whether it's vineyard robots or fine Zweigelt. What a story it is.
Indeed. Our thanks to Jamie Marfell and Hans and Therese Herzog, also to those who kindly sent in samples for us to pick the best wines from. Thanks also to New Zealand wine growers for sponsoring this episode, particularly Chris Stroud for his support.
Most of all, thanks to you for tuning in and joining us. Until next time, cheers.